Welcome to Around the Empire. I'm your host, Joanne Leon. Dr. Neda Bolourchi is here with us today to talk about the recent developments with the Iran deal and the withdrawal of troops from Iraq and more. This is a fully independent podcast. Lend your support at patreon.com/aroundtheempire or paypal.me/aroundtheempirepod. And please like, share, and subscribe on YouTube. In our discussion, we talk about the recent developments with the JCPOA Iran deal and how the Trump administration is trying to, quote-unquote, have its cake and eat it too. We discuss the happenings in the UN General Assembly and the UN Security Council, the news of troop withdrawals from Iraq, and a lot more. And there's an extra bonus segment for patrons, episode 186 Extra, Middle East Prospects in the New Cold War Era. Dr. Bolourchi teaches at Rutgers University, New Brunswick, the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. She's a thought leader whose work crosses multiple fields, from the academic to the legal to foreign policy and more. Her academic research examines the transformative discourse on Iran during the 20th century across the political and religious spectra. She completed years of research in Iran, Syria, and Armenia, and she's provided foreign policy and security analysis and commentary for a variety of publications and news channels internationally. We recorded this on September 23rd, 2020. Neda Bolourchi is here, speaking to us from New Jersey. She's returning to the show. Thanks so much for coming back, Neda. It's great to talk to you again.
Thank you for having me back, Joanne.
So Neda and I are both here in New Jersey, actually, which is technically a hotspot state in the coronavirus pandemic. Although Neda is in a hotter spot than I am further north. And, quite a few changes at Rutgers over the last few months. So how are things going, and how are people adjusting to the virtual universities?
Well, thank you for the question. Rutgers has been doing pretty well. We get these weekly, so there's thorough testing for those who are on the campuses. Rutgers has the 3 campuses across New Jersey. And so we get weekly updates as to the testing procedures and percentages of individuals who are found positive. I do have to say the majority of work and teaching and learning is happening virtually as a precaution, particularly for undergraduates. I will tell you, I earned a sort of a mini grant, as it were, to have 3 undergraduate research assistants, and none of them are on campus. But they visit campus to do work and to access the facilities as they can within the limited scope that it's available. I think we're still learning how to best use online teaching resources. And there are sometimes technical glitches, but and students are patient with us, and we're patient with students. I think in some ways, like I've learned, it can be students can be actually more engaged with certain learning tools. And then sometimes they just want to sit there and listen as you lecture. And you just have to do your best to not bore them. So visual keys, I'm a little bit of a Luddite, and I am a bit of a traditional teacher in the sense that I had, I spent my formative education just in lecture halls. And I believe in active learning. So I'm not a huge proponent of PowerPoint and slides. I think it makes for passive learning. So I have learned how to use them better. My students, we do sort of a lot of things with good images, good cartoons, short clips to sort of break up the lecture.
Yeah, exactly.
And sort of instantaneous polling. And I use a perennial pop quiz that I can sort of launch at any moment to kind of. Yes, I'm one of those. So it's a mixed bag, but I think we're At least in the social sciences and humanities, we don't have to be in sort of the physical lab as it is. We're doing okay, but looking forward to getting back on campus.
Yeah, I saw on the
It
news that,
is, despite what we try, it's still not the same.
yeah. Well, first, I can't imagine. I went to College of Engineering. I can't imagine doing that virtually. Uh, so that's interesting. But I don't have any kids at Rutgers this year. I might have another one going there. I'm not sure yet. But my son had already, there were already, he had taken some hybrid courses, which are, one lecture in class in person and the other virtual. So, the schools were already doing things like that, thank God, because if they hadn't been, oh boy, that would have been a tough transition. But yeah, so I guess there'll be some good things that come out of it. But I generally share I did all of my work also in person in lectures too. So, I guess we'll see. We'll see how. But I did see in the news that they planned to bring people back on campus in the spring semester. Is that true or?
Yes, so there is sort of a continuation of the committees that are looking at how to plan for the spring semester, what the numbers from this semester will tell us, what the practices from this semester will tell us going forward into the spring. As you know, New York and New Jersey have considerably flattened the curve, as it were. And so that is all good news in terms of in-class, on-campus learning and teaching. So the discussion is being had as to how to best do it, and it will be a continuation of this hybrid methodology where certain things will be open, certain things will clearly have reduced numbers. So they're moving forward. The administration is moving forward in that way.
Well, best of luck with all of that.
Thank you very much.
I'm biased toward Rutgers, of course. I want things to go well. So today we have an ambitious episode today, Neda and I. We're going to try to cover four things. Right now, the UN General Assembly is going on, and a battle between the U.S. and Iran and other members of the UN Security Council. So we're going to talk about that. We have a recent announcement that there will be a U.S. troop withdrawal in Iraq. I'm going to ask Neda for her thoughts on that. And then we're going to try to talk a little bit about Lebanon and what's going on in Lebanon and the various actors, foreign influence going on there. And then lastly, we're going to go to sort of a big picture for the bonus question about, clearly things are turning to a Cold War environment. I don't think many people would disagree that we are already now engaging in a Cold War, maybe not quite like the last Cold War, but we're there. And what happens with our Middle East policies as we shift toward this, what do they call it? Great power conflicts or great power challenges, or I forget what terms they use. So we're going to talk about that in the bonus question. So should we start with what's going on at the UN? Neda, do you want to sort of catch us up on what the current conflict is? It's been an ongoing pressure campaign against Iran. And the complications of having withdrawn from the Iran deal, the JCPOA, and sort of wanting to have our cake and eat it too. So if you could
I thoroughly, if I can interrupt you, believe in having your cake and eating it too. One does not make, I actually had believe it or not too long ago, a sort of philosophical debate with somebody about the fact that you make a cake so you can eat it.
Well, that's true.
Which
cliche.
is not, I think, the metaphor we're looking for when it comes to the Trump administration at the UN. But yes, to maintain that sort of metaphor, yes, the Trump administration wants to have its cake and eat it too. And so what's happening is that on September 19th, on Saturday, the State Department released a statement, as they said that they would, that appears to be in accord with international law and UN procedures. And I say that it appears to be because this is actually not the case, which is why the UN Security Council and the head of the United Nations, the Secretary General, everyone is sort of in an uproar, as it were, because the Secretary Pompeo's statement is not accurate. And his statement that was released basically says that the U.S. notified the president of the Security Council. And for those who don't know, the presidency of the Security Council rotates every month. And so in August, it was held by Indonesia. And so the United States notifies the president of the Security Council of Iran's significant non-performance of JCPOA commitments, i.e. that Iran is violating the nuclear deal. And so, according to the State Department, by notifying the Security Council president, this triggers a 30-day process that if Iran's violations of the nuclear deal of the JCPOA are not resolved, then snapback occurs of previously terminated UN sanctions. And so the 30 days has gone by, and that was September 19th. And so in theory, if the United States was correct in its position, then all the legal mechanisms that were set up by the JCPOA would have, in accord with the legal mechanisms set up by the JCPOA, all the resolutions that were superseded by UN Resolution 2231, which is, to be very clear, UN Resolution 2231 is the resolution that supports the JCPOA. And so if the United States was theoretically correct about Iran's, if the United States had, let me put it this way legally, if the United States had standing, if it was in the position to report noncompliance, then all the provisions that had been replaced by 2231 become effective again, i.e. the arms embargo against Iran becomes effective again. And so I just want to sort of make it very clear as to why the U.S. Doesn't have standing, and that is because the U.S. is not a participant state. And this phrase participant state is the key, the issue on which all of the rest of this conversation hinges. In the JCPOA, as well as Resolution 2231, the phrase participant state is in all the clauses related to dispute mechanisms, related to the dispute mechanisms and snapback and any sort of sanction, that you must be a participant state in order to provoke snapback, in order to partake in the dispute resolution. So if you are not a participant state, then you don't have standing, i.e. you are not affected by it, right? And so the U.S. withdrew in word and action, according to the other participant states, as well as the majority of the UN Security Council, on May 8th, 2018.
Trump withdrew and bragged about it.
Right. So that was, and importantly, if one sort of looks at this as like a contract, you just don't necessarily operate on words. You also see, did they follow through in action? And so again, as part of the reporting bodies related to the nuclear deal, the United States doesn't have a representative. And so it wasn't just that the Trump administration said, we are no longer participating, we withdraw, but then they withdrew all of their appointees and civil service individuals who would otherwise have been on those bodies and in those organizations. And so this is confirmation that we have that in word and in action, the United States is not a participant state. And if it's not a participant state, then it can't provoke any of these sort of triggers, as it were. And so this is basically what the fight has been about, as to whether or not the U.S. can provoke them. Here's the thing. So the State Department can say that it is that the United States is adhering to the JCPOA and UN, or it's adhering to UN resolutions, right? We know legally that is not the case, right? The Secretary General of the UN has said that 13 of the 15 Security Council members, i.e., everyone but I think it's the Dominican Republic and the US, has said that the United States actually is not in a position to trigger or provoke any of these mechanisms. But in effect, so despite the legality of it, where are we in reality? The reality is that the United States controls the world financial system, as it were. And this is in conjunction for two things. One, because of its dominance of the world sort of financial system. And two, following 9/11, the US initially, not legally, was getting SWIFT information from the Europeans. And then because there was sort of this blowback about the legality of that, they made it a formal deal. And SWIFT basically is this mechanism that tracks financial transactions, right? So every bank in the world largely runs through this institution. And so if something doesn't look correct, I mean, there are obviously smaller sort of computerized systems at the local and national levels as well, but so much runs through SWIFT that keeps track of the currencies that are being used for transactions. And so the Europeans have been sharing this information with the United States for nearly 2 decades now, if not longer. And so between the US's control of the financial markets and the information it gets through SWIFT, it can impose sanctions. And so in the announcement that came out on September 19th, Secretary of State Pompeo said that there will be, for anyone who decides to violate what he is calling UN resolutions, that there will be sanctions, i.e., if you're a French bank, if you're a Chinese military arms dealer, if you are related with the Russians, anyone and everyone is susceptible to these sanctions. This is not actually new. So this part of it is not new. This has been ongoing since the beginning of the Trump administration, and particularly since May 2018, where the combination of the Treasury Department and the State Department have been designating, largely by executive order, individuals and entities for their violations of US sanctions. And so they were hoping to add these UN ones as well, at least in name. And so just to be clear, when the Secretary of State talks about that there's potential for secondary sanctions, the United States is way beyond imposing secondary sanctions. The investigations have gone to sort of the 4th, 5th, 6th level in some of the cases. And there are lawsuits there are lawsuits countering these designations in district court in Washington, D.C., where they're suing the Treasury Department. Certain entities and individuals are suing the Treasury Department for wrongly labeling those individuals and entities. So this idea of secondary, tertiary, quaternary, all the way up to the 7th level sanctions isn't new. This idea that they are multilateral, UN supported is very different, and how the administration is couching it is very different, and is wrapped up in this idea that diplomacy was at work here, when in fact this is nothing but sort of an imposed sort of will of the president and his campaign promise on the world financial system in order to go after Iran. And this is, I mean, to be also on the other side, very fair. This is the desire to use sanctions has long predates this administration. It blows up, really, to be very casual about it. It blows up with the Obama administration, and the use of sanctions by it. But one thing that's very important is that the Obama administration, particularly when it came to Iran and some of the other countries that top the sanctions list, is the way that it's used, right? You don't sort of have there's usually multilateral diplomacy engaged in trying to have multiple countries that will sanction another government, and then and two, it's a little more finely honed, and so that you don't necessarily get maybe bystanders, or a whole population doesn't get caught up in it. And to that, I would just sort of say, a lot of people, when it comes to the Iran sanctions, have pushed back, saying, these sanctions wouldn't adversely affect the people of Iran if the government wasn't so corrupt, and they let medicine through, and they let food, and if they didn't have so many middlemen who were chipping away, which there might be some merit to that, but this is such an egregious situation. The Europeans had to go out and create another mechanism to try and get food and medicine to Iran. So, and that they had to work around all of the sanctions and work with the administration to say, you are literally keeping food and medicine. You keep saying, and defenders of the administration's policy keep saying that no, food and medicine, this shouldn't be a problem. But the reality, right? Again, the reality is that is exactly what's happening. The same way that in theory, there would be snapback provisions, except the reality is that the U.S. is not a participant state.
Yeah, that's complicated.
It's very complicated, and I may have sort of said a lot very quickly. So please let me answer any questions on where it's vague, or I should explain a little clearer.
Yeah, the bottom line is, the United States uses that the superiority over the financial systems to flex their muscles. And I think what you're saying is that in other administrations, they try to make it somewhat legal. The Trump administration doesn't care about the legalities. And they're supposed to leave in place ways for humanitarian aid, food, medicines, and for Iran to be able to do business, to get the basic necessities so that you don't affect a whole population, as you said. I mean, there are always stories about how Iran, very defiant right now, looks for every possible way. So you have all of these experts in the law, in finance, in policy, in government, in foreign policy. They're looking for ways that are, I guess, technically legal to still be able to do business, to sell their oil and to get the weapons that they need, or parts, or whatever. And it seems like the Trump administration is just going around trying to plug every hole. And they threaten our allies that they better not, allow any of this trade to happen.
Well, exactly. I mean, that's why the E3 they made a joint statement in June. They made 2 joint statements in the last 2 months about the position that the United States has taken. And so, the Secretary of State Pompeo's response was, it's unfortunate that the Europeans have sided with the Ayatollahs, or it's unfortunate that the Europeans have decided to perpetuate terrorism. Clearly, that is not the case.
Right.
I mean, he earlier in August, even Secretary of Pompeo said the Europeans want to side with us, but they just didn't. Well, no, it wasn't that they just didn't. It's that the Europeans worked on a framework, they made a legal instrument, and they're sticking to that. It is quite the irony that the Islamic Republic, the biggest proponent of not adhering to international law starting in 1980, that how international law was for sort of the superpowers and that they would never understand and they would never adhere to the law, they just want to impose the law, that the Islamic Republic has become all of a sudden in the last 10 years a proponent of international law.
Yeah.
And that the U.S. is sort of seen in this position now as a violator of the law. And so I don't, the U.S. is long with has sort of kept a very arm's distance from international criminal, from the ICC and the ICJ, and generally international law as it seeped into our own legal system. But it is really quite the irony that the U.S. is in this position, that it is, in essence, pretending that it's adhering to international agreements, and that it is sort of affirming them through these sanctions when that's actually not the case.
Yeah. Yeah, it's bizarre. I mean, it's really just bizarre to watch this whole thing, and we don't even know what goes on in the background with, you would think there are almost certainly threats of like, hey, nice business you got there. It won't be so easy for you to do business if you don't do what we say, regardless of the legality or fairness or anything. I've seen this happen with Russia too, where Putin ends up in the position where he is the one, advocating for treaties, advocating for adherence to international law, and for people like me who grew up during the Cold War, I mean, that's just kind of all backwards. They're supposed to be the bad guy, and and now it looks like, as you mentioned, the International Criminal Court. We're getting in trouble with them too, which, I mean, we set up a lot of those things. I don't know. It's just.
Well, I would just also say this, that for everyone who, now that we are, as sort of these provisions and resolutions are expiring, just to reiterate, the JCPOA was not necessarily the end all be all, right? I think that what also gets lost when people talk about, the arms embargo was expiring in 2020. Yeah, but there was 5 years in which that Iran was supposed to be under watch. And here's by international bodies, by UN inspectors, by the international organization, IAEA. And so Iran could have been in violation under those terms. And the US, had it not walked away, had it been present on every single one of those bodies and in part of the dispute resolution, it could have hammered away on those things, right? And simultaneously, here's the main part that I want to say, because the Iranians really didn't understand what they were asking about in siloing the nuclear deal away from all other issues, right? So opponents of the JCPOA say, well, you didn't deal with its malign activity in the Middle East. You didn't deal with its weapons. You didn't deal with this. That is true. But here was the thing. You had a foundation, right? You just dealt with one thing. And importantly, the JCPOA did not get rid of sanctions on Iran for its malign activities. And so when President Obama is still in office, the Iranians are knocking at the door of the State Department and the Treasury Department saying, we're supposed to get relief. And the Obama officials were like, you wanted to silo everything else apart. So all the sanctions dealing with terrorism are still on.
Yeah, and that oil trade too. I mean,
that affects all of their economy. And so when people say the JCPOA, they ignore the fact that there were still sanctions on Iran and that the Iranians were still having a very difficult time getting the economy back that they wanted, the way that they expected, the way that Iran's President Rouhani had promised. because the negotiators had asked for a siloed negotiation, the terrorism sanctions were still on. And so when you blow up the nuclear deal, which is kind of where we're at, then you can't go back and negotiate on the terrorism, right?
Right, exactly.
And
And
so,
all trust is gone now, you know.
right. I mean, now you have a leader in a country who says, well, the United States is, they don't keep their word.
Yeah.
How can you go back to negotiate something when your supposed partner is not trustworthy? And so rather than seeing and other people accepting the JCPOA as sort of the roof on the house, they should have seen it as the foundation.
Right,
And
right.
if you actually see the JCPOA as a foundation, then you build on the foundation, right? If you have a good foundation, then you have a well-built house. So I think that's a key thing that people really just don't pay attention to. They don't listen, or just don't know that was such a viable option in terms of where to proceed from with the JCPOA.
Right. And it seems pretty clear that this administration in Iran is not going to deal with the Trump administration. They're just not. And they're waiting. I want to get into what happened today too in Security Council, but um, they're hoping for a different administration to move in 2021. And it seems to me that they might be willing to try to put everything back together again if that happens. If it doesn't, if Trump gets a second term, I don't know how it can get worse or more complicated, but the our allies and our non-allies on the UN Security Council, they made it pretty clear today, right? Did they reject what actually happened in the UN Security Council?
Right. So you largely have the rejection of this attempt to have snapback. So the Secretary General said that it's not his position to get involved with the Security Council, and the legality of the U.S.'s position is unclear. And so the U.S. is, in essence, imposing these measures again without support from the rest of the Security Council or the United Nations.
Yeah, and they painted themselves into a corner because let's say the US might say, well, all right, it was a mistake. Let's assume that Trump gets a second term. All right, it was a mistake to just, withdraw from that the JCPOA altogether and let's kind of start again. But then you have an Iranian government that just doesn't trust anything that they say. I feel like they've really painted themselves in a corner. I don't know where they go from here.
Well, so this is, I think, two prongs on this. One, President Trump campaigned on this. He wants to be seen as delivering on the campaign promise. And so he will talk about how the U.S. is now sort of imposing the harshest sanctions on Iran ever. I think because of the control of the financial system, he will be accurate in saying that. It's not through the international law, and he probably won't say that. But if he is to be reelected, where does one go from here? The Iranians have sort of made it clear that that you go back to the JCPOA, and so I had a question. I was on this Middle Eastern news channel, Arabic news channel last month, Al Hadaf, that asked, well, what about in the meantime? Right, the arms embargo against Iran is over, and so yes, in theory, the Iranians should be out there buying whatever they can. Right, if I was them, I would buy as many weapons as I possibly can between now and whenever there's a reimposition of an arms embargo.
Right.
But that actually is not going to happen. So on the one side, you can say, well, the Iranian military budget, they have an increase of 9% this year. So that means that they are going to be spending money despite the sanctions, despite their economy. Their military divisions are going to be spending money. So it would make sense that they would buy arms, first and foremost, the Russian S-400. But to be clear, and the Russians have been very coy with the Iranians on this, the Russians aren't going to be selling the Iranians the S-400 anytime soon, I don't think. Even the Russian announcement over the weekend that it will cooperate with Iran in the near future and do joint exercises doesn't mean that it's going to be selling Iran the S-400. And that's because the Russians don't, they would like to keep their superior advantage over the Iranians. The Iranians don't really trust the Russians, even though there is massive cooperation, right? So I don't think that will, I think the sort of the estimates of Iran's desire to buy the S-400 and the Russians not selling the S-400 will hold. The Russians also have a bi-coastal terrain defense system separate from the S-400 that the Iranians would like to buy. This may actually get sold. And then you turn to the Chinese, and they would likely sell tanks, fighter jets. There are a number of things that the Chinese have and make that the Iranians would like to buy, except, again, a little different than the Russians. The Chinese, and I think, well, in your bonus question, we'll probably get to this on China and the Middle East. The Chinese are not going to run out and sell this equipment to the Iranians because they too are waiting to see what the election results are. Just to sort of throw in a little bit more, even if Vice President Biden wins, it's not as if things somehow revert and there isn't some pressure on a Biden White House and the Chinese, right?
Yeah.
And so everyone has been looking at this supposed China-Iran deal and the idea that Iran has become a client state of China, so that there will be this sold weaponry. Tanks, tanks don't really do a lot for Iran. Even though Iran wants tanks, tanks don't do a lot for Iran. Fighter jets are different.
And air defense, yeah.
Right. So these are sort of the other things. But I don't think that they're going to get sold in the near future, and they most certainly are not going to get delivered. So I think that there's a big, for anyone who has sort of kept abreast of aero defense systems and weapons, there's a huge lag time between the point of an announcement of a sale and the delivery of the sale. Anyone who has a history of Iranian weapons purchases knows that purchases made in the late 70s, actually didn't get delivered to Iran because of the revolution. So again, sales and delivery are a big thing. But importantly, for political reasons, I don't think that you're going to see this happen, right? And not just sanctions. The Chinese are, the United States and China are very much wedded together. The Chinese do not want to aggravate the United States, despite President Trump's rhetoric. The Chinese have sort of initiated their own or countered the president. So I do not think, and Chinese actions show that they are very measured. So I do not think that you're going to see a sale there anytime soon. And so that would encourage the return to the JCPOA. Let us not forget that both Russia and China signed off on the initial sanctions, or part of the initial UN multilateral sanctions against Iran. So there was an international case made for sanctioning Iran that was not vetoed by Russia and China. And so I think that there will be long discussions had, and everybody will encourage a return to the JCPOA regardless of who is president. I think it's less likely to happen if President Trump remains in office. But at the same time, if Vice President Biden wins, let us not think that there will automatically be a return to the JCPOA. There are options. I think the first, this idea of more for more, I think it's Jake Sullivan who has very much been a proponent of it, long time civil servant. And his idea is that you ask more of Iran and you give more, right? And so this would be a very long, drawn out negotiation process. It would, under the idea of more for more, not just encompass the nuclear deal or the nuclear issue, but it would then go into malign activities and arms, probably arms sales, but particularly discussions of Iraq, Lebanon, Syria. So it would address the Iranians' initial complaint that why do we still have sanctions on us? We just finished JCPOA, and the Obama administration saying, well, you didn't want to deal with terrorism, so here we are. Under this more for more plan, it would deal with it would propose to deal with all of the outstanding issues, but as a counter, the bigger you make the project, the more complicated it gets.
Yeah.
And so these are sort of the two camps within the Biden team of, do you just return to the JCPOA or do you do more for more? And I don't think that a lot of people like the idea of more for more, just because it is very complicated. It's unwieldy. Whereas, if you return to the JCPOA, you still, in theory, right, still have sanctions on Iran for terrorist activities. And you can try to work with Iran on those. But then it places anybody who's in office in, again, the holder of the White House then has to deal with the arms embargo, and that Iran will be wanting to purchase, again, the S-400, the Bicoastal Defense Terrain System, and fighter jets. And that historically they have reasons for that.
Yeah, I mean, there's always a lot of talk about the missile program too, that I believe it's mostly the Israeli lobby pushing for that to be hemmed in, and Iran seems to be, staunch, not wanting to budge on that, and you could sort of see both sides. But
I'm just going to chime in on there if you don't mind, because that relates to the Iran-Iraq war. And somebody recently told me, asked me, maybe the time for the Middle East has passed and the Iran-Iraq war may not be so relevant anymore. I mean, I was a little stunned. I think the Iran-Iraq war remains first and foremost in the minds of Iranians. And even if you don't care about Iranians, the idea of missiles. So there is the war, right? It's the war of the cities, which was basically a missile war. And this is why Iran insists on having its own indigenous missile program, is because Saddam Hussein started not just bombing cities, but bombing them with missiles. Let's be clear that these bombings are happening with missiles. And so they are targeting civilian centers. And so the Iranians counter. And this becomes what's called the war of the cities, but it's a missile war. And to the point that you bring up about the Israelis, again, if you talk to or listen to the governments of the Persian Gulf, they are concerned about missiles. The Israelis talk about missiles because of distance. So for anybody who kind of doesn't think missiles, I mean, I don't think anybody in DC or up and down the East Coast is going to say that missiles aren't important. But anyone who says that the Iran-Iraq war is not important, it's the lessons learned from that war that push the Iranian military sort of complex, as it were. They make up the psychological makeup of the leaders of that country, and they are passed down. So while maybe, I don't know, academically, The war is not that important anymore. I think there are still a slew of people who write on it, so I'm not going to say anything in that sense. Again, the reality, right? If we're talking about the reality of U.S. Actions, let's also talk about the reality of that war. It is very important in terms of how it psychologically and actually drives actors, both in and out of the government, um, in their negotiations. And the one other thing that I want to add about missiles is this, that also people don't talk about, is that the last, and the JCPOA, there's a lot of concern and there is a lot of rhetoric about how close Iran might or may not be to developing a nuclear weapon. I think the reports on their ability to sort of develop a nuclear weapon are, again, overestimated. But more important than even that, I will say, is this: for all the concern about missiles, I have not heard anyone say that Iran has a missile that can carry a nuclear weapon. But I have heard, technically, Iranian missiles cannot carry a nuclear warhead. The missile has to have a certain diameter. So between the propulsion, the angle that it flies off on, the weight of any supposed weapon, the diameter of missiles that carry nuclear weapons are uniform, and the technical knowledge, know-how, and the ability to manufacture that is extremely difficult. And thus far, the actual weapons inspectors, the ones who watch the Iranian missiles when they go off, on the Iranians have their certain military celebration days. The Iranians still don't have a missile the size that can carry a nuclear weapon, i.e. the diameter of the missile is wrong.
Yeah, that's my understanding too. No, I mean, the missile programs they're super important. But, it seems like and if I were Iran, to be honest, I would not give up. I wouldn't give an inch on that missile program, given the history. But, the Trump administration, they were going on, of course, their maximal pressure. And Trump seemed to believe, someone, either he came to this conclusion on his own or someone convinced him that if you just keep pressuring Iran, they're going to give in. And then the people who are pressuring him, he could get more concessions and modify the JCPOA. Well, it seems to be pretty clear that that's not going to happen. So it remains to be seen if he did get a second term, whether he would, sort of denounce and sort of reject the previous strategy and, do something different. Maybe, like you said, this more for more, or just something that doesn't involve believing that if you put enough pressure and enough pain on the Iranian government and their citizens, that they're going to come crawling back and they're going to make concessions, because it seems pretty clear from what I know that is not going to happen. So I am very curious as to what turn this might take. And like you said, the Biden administration will be under those same pressures. Whether or not they prioritize those entities who are putting the most pressure on them as highly as the Trump administration does remains to be seen. But they've given no indication that they will not be extremely friendly to the lobbies who are pushing Trump. So I agree with you that we shouldn't expect any magical turnarounds or solutions. It's going to continue.
Oh, absolutely. And I would just sort of say, there's been a big discussion in the last year about what constitutes an expert, and how this administration has not been listening to experts. And I would say, there are the legal experts, right? There are definitely those lawyers who are at the Treasury Department. There are those investigators who are in FinCEN. There are those who implement compliance programs for businesses across the board. And so we have different types of technical experts. But this idea, and they can be sort of, an Iran expert can do that and tell you about the Iranians, right? I am sure that the former director of policy at the Treasury Department, having had the experience of negotiating and writing these sort of things, will tell you the Iranians will not cave in this way, that you need a very sculpted, narrowly tailored negotiation, the same way that I will tell you that if someone had come to me, I would have said, yes, in theory, what you're saying is right. You just keep hammering away at them. What are they going to do? I would then point you, right, as an Iran expert on the subject matter, not a technical one on legalities, you should look at the Iran-Iraq war. The Iranians will tell you over and over again that they fought a war against over half of the world, and they survived, and they didn't lose an inch of land. That should tell you something about that government. That should tell you, if not the people. And so some of the conversations I've had are like, well, you know, Iran is not in the same position. It doesn't seem to have the same fervor that it did during that time period. And I will agree, but you should not underestimate the willpower of that government to withstand, and understand that you are not punishing them with your hammer.
Yeah, exactly.
And that they're not going to give up. And if you weren't paying attention, you should pay attention to what has happened with the protests. That you know, that is a government that insists on its righteousness and its power, and that the theoretical belief that you can hammer them into submission is faulty from the beginning. And if you needed evidence, I think the riots that occurred in Iran over the past couple of years will give you some, you know, you can make an algorithm to measure that, will give you the empirical evidence you need. So that there should be, to come full circle, a reevaluation of who is advising on these kind of policies.
Yeah, I very much agree. And I'll, in the show notes, I'll link my previous interviews with Neda, and we talked about that, about the population and how they react, you know, even if they don't like their government, how they understand external threats and you know, all along, just sort of a longer conversation on this topic. So you guys can go back and listen to that. So since we're getting low on time, I think we should probably move on to another topic of, and we kind of were with the Iran-Iraq war. We get a little bit into Iraq. Maybe we should move on to the troop withdrawal. So there was an announcement that the U.S. military will reduce the number of troops in Iraq from 5,000 to 3,000, and quickly, like this month. I believe there may be plans to do even more before the election. And the way they framed this was that, you know, we have much more confidence in the Iraqi security forces' ability to operate independently. That's how it was framed. We're not leaving them completely. We're going to continue advising and assisting to make sure that ISIS is not allowed, there's no resurgence, but a definite withdrawal of troops. And this is a really tangled situation. I'm very happy, but, well, just my own opinion real quick. I'm very happy about that. I'm always happy about troop withdrawals. But, you know, one of the things that keeps things toned down between us and Iran is the fact that we have troops are very vulnerable right across the border. And so that's just sort of an aside. I hope that the reasoning here is political and that it is not to reduce the number of targets that Iran could retaliate against if we launch some kind of attack on Iran. But I'm sort of getting off track there. What are your thoughts on this Iraq troop withdrawal?
I support the continued withdrawal of U.S. troops from Iraq. Basically, as a kid, when Iraq was invaded in 2003, I knew enough to know that they did not have weapons of mass destruction, that was a lie. there was this resurfacing that they were linked to 9/11, which I don't even remember that
Yeah.
having been an excuse. And I will just say an excuse. The United States had no business in Iraq. And so it from its inception, it was a mistake. It was carried out as a mistake. The Obama administration, despite some advances under some of the generals who are now famous, made numerous errors in handling the situation in Iraq. And so I do think that the troop withdrawal from Iraq is a very good thing. And that the reduction, the glide slope, as General McKenzie at CENTCOM talks about, from 5,200 troops to 3,000, is appropriate. I don't think that it is a measure to reduce the number of targets for Iran. To be, I think, very clear, and as we saw last year with Saudi Arabia, Iran has numerous targets. And while it can sort of fly missiles into Iraq, again, to sort of paraphrase one of the great Israeli generals, the attack on Saudi Arabia was nothing short of a phenomenal success for the Iranians. So I do not think that the withdrawal from Iraq really has to do with Iran. I think that it's a campaign promise. I think that the president and this administration sort of sees it as more bleeding in money and bodies from the United States that are unnecessary and should not have, and I will add in my 2 cents, should not have occurred to begin with. Quite frankly, you cannot be an you cannot continue to be an occupying force. It just, history has shown, really, if you do not thoroughly occupy a country, and I mean thoroughly, in the most destructive way, you cannot stay there. And the United States, which is not to advocate for that, let me be clear, but if you were to invade and occupy a country, you have to do it in some of the most devastating ways if you're going to stay. And that did not occur. The American public and none of the administrations have the stomach for that, rightfully so. And so we have also seen the longer an occupation goes out, the more it drains a country's resources, the less likely it is to succeed. And so while it doesn't look good, it does correct an initial wrong.
Yeah, and it's true that while I don't think that Iran should get quite as much credit for the attack on Saudi Arabia, I think it's more complicated than that with the Houthis and so on, and the structure that they have built. The Gulf states are, very aware of their vulnerability, and so there's going to be all kinds of. I'm sure there was, and there still is, all kinds of pressure. They don't want to be attacked again, and now, especially now that it's proven that it can be done and make it look easy. So
right. Well, I mean, it was an inside job, right? That's sort of the coup de grace of what happened. Is that you had to have people on the ground, on the ground. So it's a bloodless attack that takes out numerous central sort of vital parts of infrastructure at a time when you're not going to have the European contractors who are supposed to be there because it's the weekend. You're not going to have the Saudis who may be on duty. So you have to have people really on the ground watching to make sure that everything is running as it's supposed to be running and to guide
the targets. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So to your point, yes. Should we give the Iranians all the credit? No. It requires, right? There are populations who are very upset about a variety of political decisions made by the Saudis. And that will feed any activity. I work on minorities and research minorities. And so I get individuals who are like, well, how would you advise? And my advice is treat all of your population equally badly. right? Just treat them equally badly.
If you're
And then,
Saudis, yeah, yeah.
I mean, anybody, right? Like, so throughout the Middle East, you have these pockets. And so just treat them all equally badly. There is not a government that is not in some way not violating civil rights and civil liberties. So just do it equally badly, because no person really wants to be a traitor and be a fifth column, right? They want to be part of. That's the whole point of nationalism. If you have mobilized your nationalist propaganda correctly, then you have made adherents of your population, not saboteurs. And so if they're equally treated badly, then everybody is treated badly.
Yeah.
And so you won't have, in essence, you won't have that inside person or people, as it were.
Yeah, the motivation for it, or the nothing left to lose attitude. The I mean, the Saudis have enough trouble as it is without trouble with Iran, right? The people who they treat more badly, to use your framing, live in and around most of their resources. So they got a real problem. They got a big problem. I could just imagine the kind of pressure they are putting on the Trump administration to knock it off. But I don't know. They confuse me. They also I saw something about how King Salman made his debut at the UN, and he was trashing Iran through the whole thing. But maybe we just don't understand the rituals of that these countries and their leadership, verbally say all these things, and then in the background they're all talking to each other and dealing with each other. So it's hard for us to understand what the norms are there. And I sure hope that Trump understands it, because it's still it's just a little too like, I think there are those things in place where some of our allies would like say don't don't do anything that might cause an attack on us, but it still seems like something could be set off just way too easily. But maybe
I think that's particularly the case, and I think in many ways this withdrawal is a good idea if it's actually carried out to its fruition. The idea of that if the United States leaves, in large part, the Middle East, then the actors themselves have to be responsible for their actions and their words.
Yeah.
So you kind of get rid of this paternalism and this, neo-Orientalism that's been going on for centuries, where people have to be agents and make decisions for themselves and their governments. And so if the Trump administration, one, if it continues, and two, if it continues in this way, I think can work, right? I've seen some thoughts that it will, in fact, not leave the Middle East, that involves some convoluted thinking. But and then the idea is that, and Trump himself has said it, that you continue sort of sales, but do you want a heavily armed Middle East? One, it's already heavily armed. Two, deterrence has been the modus operandi of the United States for a long time. Again, the Iran-Iraq War, but also the Cold War. So there are some benefits to this idea if carried out, and carried out the way it's planned. I think the Trump administration, in this sense, may be on more sure footing than it has been in the past with the Middle East.
Well, that seems like a great opportunity to transition into the bonus question, and I don't think we're going to have enough time, unfortunately, though I hope I can get you back to talk about the broader picture with particularly Lebanon and the French neocolonialism that you had mentioned. But it does seem like a perfect opportunity to switch over into the bonus question, and that is, what's going to happen going forward with the Middle East? How, in your words, how the Middle East will or will not fit in with any potential new Cold War with China. And of course, that depends on how the election goes. So how about if we tackle that one? The answer to the bonus question is in a bonus segment for patrons. You can get access to these bonus segments, there's one for almost every interview, by subscribing at Patreon. Plus, you get access to other patrons-only episodes and our new Discord channel where we can talk among ourselves, do Q&A live streams and such. So that's my tease. I hope some of you will join us. And now I'll continue with the interview wrap-up. Any final statements that you'd like to talk about before we close?
I don't think so.
Yeah, I think we covered everything.
I feel like I made a few conclusive statements and then proceeded to keep talking, so I will just stop talking.
All right.
But thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. Hope to talk to you soon.
Same here, and please stay safe and well and take care.
You too. Thanks for listening. A special thanks to Neda Bolourchi. Find Neda at LinkedIn and find her work at Rutgers University Center for Middle Eastern Studies webpage. This podcast is independent media, so listener support is important. Patreon.com/AroundTheEmpire or PayPal.me/AroundTheEmpirePod. Find the podcast on any mobile podcast app, on the website AroundTheEmpire.com, on Patreon, or on YouTube. And if you're listening on YouTube, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Follow on Twitter at Around the Empire, and we'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.